If you have a desire to change relationship dynamics in your life or call in new relationships, you've got to pay special attention at the pathway of intelligence and the pathway of defense. Intelligence in the gift and city, and it turns into defense when we spiral down into the shadow frequency. And this pathway connects two spheres. One is the IQ, and the other is the EQ. And both of those are probably terms that you've heard before, but we're going to refer to them differently than you probably have seen prior to now. Typically, IQ, we're thinking about intellect. We're thinking about how much knowledge we have and how we can share that knowledge with the world, and sounding smart, and scientists and doctors and lawyers and all of that left brain understanding of the world. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there is another side, and that's our EQ, or our emotional intelligence. And that is more true in the Gene Keys to the definition of how the rest of the world would portray it. However, it goes much deeper. It's much deeper than just how you interact with others, but it's about how you feel your own emotion, and then how, therefore, you project that emotion onto other people and what happens with that interaction. And this pathway teaches us how to balance our IQ and our EQ. And that's why there's a shadow component and a gift component, because at the shadow, we're out of balance between these two things. Either we're driven by our IQ and we're emotionally disconnected. That's typically more masculine in nature. And it leads to us thinking through everything. However, when we do that, when we put our mind over our feelings, what happens is our life force gradually starts to get sucked away from us. Because our feelings are what give us that charge. They're what give us our drive. They're what give us our energy. The feelings are there as kind of a compass, kind of a way to keep you moving forward. When you feel peace, when you feel joy, when you feel love, we want more peace, joy, and love. If we don't have those things, then we start to only see the details. We start to only see what's happening external to us, and that comes at a cost. Yes, we can observe the world and we can further science, and at the same time, if we keep emotion out of that picture, why are we doing all of it? It doesn't make us any happier. It doesn't make us any closer to feeling at home and at peace in the world and in our bodies. At the same time, if we put our feelings over our mind and we let those things take charge, what we end up with is a nervous system that is falling apart. Although our emotions are a guide, they're there as a part of the puzzle, not the whole thing. And if we let emotion run our life, we become exhausted. We're constantly fighting against ourselves, fighting against other people, and our nervous system can only do that for so long before it starts to break down, before things start to fall apart. And so if we let our IQ take over, it comes at the sacrifice of being compassionate, being loving. We miss all sorts of different information. Whereas if we let our EQ take charge, we can't communicate how we're feeling. We can't interact with the world. And both of those lead us to a place where we double down on our shadows because we think that other people aren't hearing us for what we're saying. We think that other people aren't accepting us. And then we fall into these shadow patterns, these trigger patterns. So last time I briefly talked about your IQ and your EQ and what they represent. And your IQ is your psychology. It's this mental model that you have of the world. And you built this mental model because at some point from 14 to 21 years old, you felt emotionally overwhelmed. And your body had to figure out a way to bring you back down into the functioning world because it felt dangerous. It felt like this emotional charge was going to be the end of the world, or you were going to do something that was going to cause the end of the world. And so we use our intellect, we use our mind to control what we're thinking and therefore lasso in our emotions. That comes at a cost though. And that cost is we didn't honor the emotion, and then it starts to get stuck in us and we repress it and it comes out somewhere else in a different way. And we might not know or realize that that's what's happening, but at some unconscious level, that stuff always comes out. That's why it's so important to have outlets and to have support networks so that you decide how to process that emotion instead of letting it sneak out sideways and affect somebody else in your life that you don't want it to affect. Then we get to our EQ, and our EQ is our ideology, and it was developed sometime between 7 and 14 years old. And this pattern comes about because you were in some sort of emotionally charged situation at some point over the course of these years. And it's worth doing some reflection and thinking about the big moments that you have in your brain that are tied to that period of time, and to see what behavior you took and to analyze why you think you might have taken that behavior, and to see how it continually shows up in different forms throughout your life until we are willing to look at the shadow and put an end to the loop. And this is something that's a little bit deeper than our IQ. It's a little more animal, a little older part of our brain is involved here. And a lot of times it's thoughts like, I'm not good enough, or nobody cares about me, or I'm not lovable. But your EQ and your IQ are designed to work together. They're designed to balance off of one another. And when we start to identify the patterns in real time, we can take both pieces of information and we can learn to integrate them and balance them. And that takes us from the pathway of defense to the pathway of intelligence. And when I said masculine and feminine here, I'm talking about archetypes. So it doesn't mean male and female, but it does mean that yang energy, that doing energy, tends to be tied to the intellect. And the yin energy, the accepting energy, the emotional energy, tends to be tied more to the emotions. And there's a big difference, I already hinted at this once, between intellect and emotion, or excuse me, intelligence. So intellect is tied to knowledge. Intelligence is tied to wisdom. So in order to have intelligence, we're not just taking in things from our mind. We're taking things in from our astral body. We're taking things in from our physical body. We're taking in information that is beyond our 5 senses. And when we learn to utilize all of that information, that is intelligence. Intelligence is a process that is directly tied to awakening. As we grow in intelligence, we grow in awakening. Because it is our intelligence. It is using all of this deep information that we have, all of this wisdom that goes back hundreds and thousands of years, tapping into that is how we're able to interact in the world in a magical way, in a way that allows us to stay in flow and shows us that the universe is looking out for us and that we're safe. If we try and think our way to solutions, if we try and think our way to answers, we miss out on all of that other stuff. And you cannot think your way to the truth. The truth is a paradox. As we approach an understanding of it all, everything starts to fall apart, as evidenced by quantum physics. We can get so close to the truth, but our minds just can't get us across the finish line. And that's because this universe is set up to be a paradox. We're not supposed to be able to use the intellect in order to discover truth. We've leaned so heavily on science to find truth. But what we've gotten now to a point is that science is really turned into almost a religion. It's just another dogma. It's there trying to prop up itself. It's oftentimes not open to things possibly working a different way, open to being wrong. And that's what happens when we get stuck in the intellect. We think we have these facts, but those facts are dependent upon all the other facts that we have in our mind, all the other stuff that we've learned. And so intelligence is about balanced, open, and respectful communication. And therefore, intelligence is an interaction. It's an interaction between us and the world, and it's an interaction between us in our relationship. Sorry, I ran out of room down there. So the only way that we can actually find our intelligence is to engage with something that the universe is providing to us. And that might be a situation, that might be a person. Intelligence helps us to interact with that thing in a way that raises our frequency, because we see that as long as I stay in flow, as long as I feel safe and I can understand that the situation or person being presented to me is there to further my higher purpose, then it really doesn't matter what we label the thing, whether we see it as good or we see it as bad. Intellect isn't a reaction, it's a state. It's a state of individual being. And that's what keeps us trapped in our mind. Intelligence pushes us outward to engage with the world. Intellect pushes us inward, but not deep inside. It keeps us trapped up here in our mind, and we hear those constant thoughts that won't stop running as we try to figure everything out, but we just cannot figure everything out. And because intelligence is an interaction, that also means that it is tied directly to our karma. And I just did a video on the pathway of karma talking about the workings as the gene keys see it. But intelligence being an interaction, what it allows us to do is unwind our karma in a useful way, in a way that serves us and the person that we're interacting with, or the situation that we're interacting with. It requires intelligence to mine the lessons from our karma. Every relationship has a wisdom inside of it. And if you remember, intelligence ties to wisdom. And in order to pull that wisdom out, we've got to let the karma unwind. And we can't let our shadow patterns, the behaviors that are rutted, that we've had for decades, get in the way. If we do that, we're not going to learn the lessons from our karma. We're not going to get this wisdom without being balanced between our IQ and our EQ. Now, it's also called the pathway of defense because if you slip into the shadow frequency of your IQ or your EQ, so person one slips into the shadow of their IQ and says something inflammatory. And they're talking to person two. What do you think the natural reaction is if somebody says something inflammatory? That's going to trigger person two's EQ, and they're going to feel some sort of negative emotion. And in feeling that negative emotion, they're going to interact with person one. It's going to come across in their aura, and person one is going to get even deeper or more deeply triggered. And they're going to say something else that causes person two to go further down into their shadow frequency. And we end up in this downward spiral into the shadow. And this is what's called the Eden loop in the gene keys. And it is this downward fall, getting sucked back into our patterns, engaging with somebody in a way that might make us right or might make us feel like I said what I needed to say to this person, and in this moment I feel better. However, after that interaction is over, we look around and we realize that, okay, I was right, but now I'm miserable because of it. So the question that you have to ask yourself is, do you want to be right? Or do you want to be happy? Do you want love? Obviously, I encourage you to choose love, to choose happiness. And the good news is, even though this is a two-person interaction or more than two people, it only takes one person to change the course of that interaction. It only takes one person to break the Eden loop. And if you look back at my last pathway video, I talk about relationships changing because one person changes. And if I'm in a dynamic and I change my response, then the response coming from the other person is also going to change. And so because you change, there is a new dynamic. Your aura interacting with this other person's aura creates a new situation and a new opportunity for you and that other person to choose differently. So doing this work is internal work. You do not need to change the other person. So often we want the other to change. We want them to be different. What I'm telling you right now is they have to be different if you are different. And it takes extreme ownership. So what we have to learn is how to break the Eden loop. And when we break the Eden loop, the opposite happens. Our frequency gradually raises over time. And that is how we walk the pathway of intelligence. One person can make a choice to disengage. And when that happens, magic happens. Because it gives space for grace, it gives space for forgiveness, it gives space for understanding. So in the Gene Keys Venus Sequence book, Richard Rudd, the founder of the Gene Keys, if you're not familiar, mentions this exercise called joining. And I'm drawing a blank on who the psychologists are that he took this from, but essentially the example is this. If your partner comes to you and says, "What the heck? I'm always doing the dishes. Why don't you ever do them?" Your gut reaction is probably going to be, "What do you mean? I just did the dishes yesterday." And that exact response is what triggers the other person to dig in even deeper and to go farther. So instead, what we say is, you're right. I didn't do the dishes today. And I understand how that could be frustrating. And I don't think that it's fair that you said that, because I've done the dishes a couple times this week already. And then the other person is disarmed because you agreed with them. You said, you know what, you're right. I didn't do the dishes and I'm sorry. And just that little bit of space allows the other person to say, you're right, you do the dishes sometimes. I'm sorry that I overreacted. And just that small thing breaks this Eden loop. One other thing that's really important to know here is the IQ and the EQ are comparable to the life's work and the evolution. Meaning that they are conscious choices that we can make. And when we choose differently here, they affect later parts of our profile. So just like the life's work and evolution are connected by this pathway of challenge, our IQ and our EQ are connected to this pathway of intelligence. However, because this wisdom is hologenetic in nature, this pathway of challenge could also be considered the pathway of challenge for our Venus sequence work. Except this challenge relates at a deeper level. It relates to our emotions, it relates to our heart, and therefore understanding this challenge, learning to respond differently here, is actually what, at a deeper level, controls what we do here in our sphere, in our life's work and evolution. This is external, right? This is the outside world. This is internal, what's happening in our bodies. However, they're stacked one on top of the other. The Gene Keys profile is laid out in a linear way because it's easier for our mind to understand. But in reality, the spheres and the pathways are all stacked on top of one another. And these pathways of challenge, which there's one more in the Pearl sequence, which is the pathway of initiative, the spheres on either end are the spheres that we need to really sit with and really be with and contemplate and see them showing up in our world. Because when we do that, those are the times that we can respond differently. And when I respond differently at my IQ and my EQ, it affects my SQ and my core wound. Just like when I respond differently at my life's work and evolution, it affects my radiance and my purpose. I think I've hammered home enough how important this pathway is. I thought I was going to talk forever about this, but ultimately I think simple is key here, because it's so easy to get lost in the intellect, to get lost in thinking about it. But in reality, this is something that we need to feel here. This is something that our body intuitively knows how to do and knows how to handle. And so I don't want you to think about it too much. I want you to engage with it in the world, and I want you to feel it. And in feeling that, pay attention. When are we in the pathway of defense? When are we tightening down? When are we holding on to our old patterns, trying to fight and struggle and be in fear and control? Or when are we on the pathway of intelligence? When are we able to let go? When are we able to forgive, to have unconditional love? And I promise you, the days and the moments that you choose intelligence will feel so different from the days that you choose defense. And the outcomes that you have in your life, the things that show up, will be different. They will be of a higher frequency when you choose intelligence. And that's how we start to manifest the life that we want, instead of staying stuck in the Eden loop and stuck in the shadows and stuck calling in the same things designed to teach us the same lessons that we refuse to listen to. Okay, we have our wisdom call at the end of this week. It's on Friday, July 26th at noon Eastern Standard Time. We meet on Google Meet and talk about the gene keys, talk about what we're learning, talk about circumstances in our lives. And we'll go deep with a few people, and everyone else will intuit learnings from those conversations. And I'm here to answer your questions, but you're the driver of those conversations. And everyone else is going to chime in and share their wisdom, or everyone that feels called to do so. These wisdom calls, if you're curious, I posted one to the YouTube channel a while back, and there's a playlist called Wisdom Calls. I'm going to add some more for now as we continue to go. And they are my way to engage with you and to answer your specific questions, and I would love to see you there. All right, I think that's it for today. Thank you guys for being here with me. Until next time.